The Alchemist's Prize, an original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. The light of the Miradoro lamp carved through the darkness as Jacobello navigated the arched red brick sewers beneath Rome, fixing the cloth over his nose and mouth against the smell. He stopped, the lamp swinging as he looked down at his hand-drawn map to check for the next turn. He took a deep breath and gagged, picking up the cloth to spit into the stagnant channel between the brick walkways. He scoffed at the grey water, dropping the cloth before he could taste the air, and then continued to a crossroads. He checked the map again, formerly clean fingers hovering over his path and the symbols of the seven-pointed star at each turn. He stopped with the light, investigating the closest corner until he found the old star's impression in the brick above the floor, freshly cleaned of scum by his own hand not 5 nights prior. Satisfied, he stood, stretching his neck as he rounded the corner to pass another 3 before stopping at a new intersection. He checked the map, slipping it into his satchel's outside pocket when he saw the mark of the star. He set the lamp on the ground and pulled out an old blade he'd gotten from the Society's local chapter house, crouching to scrape the middle of the bricks clean of refuse and sewage. He worked from the floor up nearest the corner, where all the other marks had been, but there was nothing. He took his tool, securing the satchel at his back and hopping over the channel to the other side of the same tunnel to start again, and then into the next and the next, until he found the familiar mark. He noted the directions on his map so that he wouldn't get lost, then finished scraping the bricks clean. The knife clattered to the floor as he reached into his satchel for a rag, lifting the lamp to look down the tunnel for any vagrants. He coughed, swallowing against the acrid reek of the air, and set back to work in the still darkness, wiping the rest of the grime away. He sighed, smiling beneath his mask at the old alchemist's mark, the septagram with a dot above each point, and the astrological symbol of the earth at the center. 4 months of research and exploration, Jacobello thought, won't have been for naught. Only one more mark to uncover, if the clues in the house are to be trusted. Then, he whispered, the old priest's cash will be mine. The Society will have to take me more seriously. He looked at the map once more, lamp squeaking beside his head, as he chose which of the 3 possible locations of the alchemist's cache would be. He'd left plenty of puzzles and word games in his study to uncover the marks in the tunnels, to uncover the path down from the house, but his riddles about the end of the line were too complicated for Jacobello to figure out. 3 possibilities are better than a blind guess, though, he thought. He turned down the next corner to try the first location, following a long tunnel that wasn't on the sewer schematic. An hour later he came back empty-handed. The second one, though, brought him in a zigzag of corners that he marked by carving into the bricks with the now dull blade. He stopped at a dead end, an archway to nowhere 3 times a man's shoulder. He furrowed his brows, looking back at the map and then to the wall before he set to work scraping the muck away from the lower bricks for the alchemist's mark. He rushed, raking the blade across the wall with a grunt and sigh. The elders of the local chapter demanded he work in the chapter house at dawn. If he couldn't find the cache tonight, there was always tomorrow, but he'd need his sleep. He wouldn't dare repeat another sleepless shift or the beating that came from it. Most of his welts had healed, but I'd rather not chance it. He worked until the lower half of the wall was cleaner than it had been in generations, but there was no mark. He hissed through his mask, panting, face burning as he pulled it down, the smell forgotten. He went to the tunnel walls either side the dead end and spent the better part of an hour scraping the bricks clean, only to stand and throw the blade into the puddle of water in the middle of the floor. He stared at the ripples, twinkling in the lamplight, teeth gritted together as he turned to the wall and stopped. Bloodshot eyes stared at the top of the arch where the bricks were cleanest, stared at the old priest's mark. It was larger than the rest, taking up 4 bricks, and sat dead center. He smiled wide and chuckled, hands coming up to wipe his face and stopping as he thought better of it. He licked his lips, hands falling to slender hips as he stepped closer, squinting in the dimness as something on the ceiling caught his eye. Letters. Words. He mouthed them under his breath, smile broadening until it might split his cheeks. Be still and know that I am God. The chapter father had said those very words all those months ago when he first came to Rome to study the secret wisdoms. The words once emblazoned over the gates of his society house when the alchemist priest still owned it. But those gates had gone to ruin with vine, weather, and time, only remembered by those who knew to study history, or were instructed by the society to tend the alchemist's former home. Those words were gone from above the gates, but they still stood on the curve of the ceiling above the mark. Another gate, another entry into the house of knowledge. His hands set to work along the wall, the floor, taking the lamp's light across the ceiling and in the corners and grooves for a button, a latch, a switch, a false brick. There was nothing. He felt along the whole tunnel until it broke into the sewer. He cursed and looked back, casting the light on the priest's words and cursing, abandoning care and thrusting his hand into the grey water up to the elbow. He groped and scraped the grimy walls for something, anything that didn't belong, that had been arranged a century before the tunnel was connected to the sewers, that would open the doors of heaven and give him that ancient starry wisdom. Water and filth splashed his face as he rushed, hissing and cursing, spraying spit at the droplets that found his tongue. He choked a gag and pulled back with a cry, uncaring if the prowlers of the dark heard him. Grey water soaked into the arm of his baggy white shirt, clinging to him with filth like the rest did from sweat. He took a deep breath, licking his lips and spitting with a curse at the filth. His trousers were sure to be soaked through as his shirt and filthy as his shoes. His skin went hot as he stared at the grey water, fists balling, a shout building in his throat as he shook the dripping wastewater from his arm and looked back to the wall. He rose, teeth clenched and blood roaring in his ears as he swallowed the shout down. He looked over his shoulder into the darkness, ears open for the sound of shuffling feet or breath. The pistol and dagger were only a reach away in his satchel, but the darkness was still as it had been his whole way. The vagabonds and criminals seemed to keep their distance from the alchemist priest's secret trail, and his old home for that matter, as if something buried and primal told them to keep away. Even above ground, there was little trouble surrounding the society house. Dullards and the desperate were the only ones who seemed stupid enough to wander onto cursed ground. The more for me. He turned back to the wall, dirty right hand settling on the center as he shut his eyes and took a deep breath. Something pulsed beneath his hand, warm and dry as a dying fire, though the brick was cold and wet. He looked up with his seeing eyes, and the alchemist's mark stung the back of his sockets, the words less so, but when he pulled his hand away, something burned in the brick. It wasn't there, just the shadow of a memory, the delusion of imagination, but the sigil was real and familiar, charring his eyes like he looked at the sun. He spun away with a hiss, eyes squeezed shut, as he leaned into the wall and panted. He blinked the stars away, opening and shutting his mouth until his ears popped, and the sight left his eyes. He looked over his shoulder, and the invisible sigil was gone, the sting in the priest's mark, and his motto, too. I don't understand, he thought. This is the final mark. This should be the cache. It has to be behind the wall. He sighed, knowing he would only get a few hours' sleep unless he headed back then and there. So he wiped his right hand with the rag and marked the end of the trail on his map. He grabbed the lamp and headed back the way he came, eyes half-focused on the tunnels as he scanned the map, marking off another path as he went, a shorter one that needn't follow the old marks. He made the final stroke and blinked heavy eyes, cramming the paper into his satchel as he rounded the final corner of tunnels into a dead end. He followed it to the middle and yawned as he walked past the neat stack of bricks and debris he'd made after breaking through the wall, all 3 feet of it. He stretched, nearly rubbing his eyes and scoffing, dropping the hand to climb the stone spiral staircase into the society house's cellar. He slid the shelves back in place to hide the doorway, and meandered from the cellar out through the garden and into the kitchens. He peeled the wet clothes from his skin until he was bare, and washed his arms, face, and feet in a basin of water before drying and rubbing scented oils on his skin to keep away the miasma. He raked his fingers through damp hair, kicking his sullied clothes onto the pile in the corner and dragging his satchel with him upstairs and into the study. The bag fell next to the door as he stared at the half-empty shelves of books and the ancient desk amid them all where he found the first clue, out of order, that thrust him onto this path. He sighed as the stagnant heat pulled beads of sweat from his skin. He wasn't so much blessed to live in a small manse as he was cursed to tend to it, so the Papal Occult Society could keep it tidy before they filled it with another, more reputable member. But he couldn't complain. His research and stubbornness would see him profit from it in the end. Slender hands went to slender hips, skin gleaming with dew in the moonlight through the large windows behind the desk, sinew and bone poking from under his skin in silvery streams. His stomach growled, but again, there wasn't enough time to eat. Too much to do, too little time, and only his hands to do it all. The knowledge that must have filled these shelves, he thought, and the wall rushed to meet him in his mind. And now it's all there, just out of reach. He swallowed, heart racing as sweat slid down his skinny frame. He shut his eyes and found the invisible burning sigil, tracing it in his mind before opening them and rushing to the desk. Paper came from one drawer, and the tray of charcoal from another before he sketched out the form, retrieving his journal and the list of sigils within. He flipped through the pages, smudging the edges and corners until he stopped, and held his sketch next to the carefully drawn shape in his book. There it was, a curious, obscure thing used only 3 times by the Society in all its history for keeping attention off what was marked. No doubt that's to be found somewhere in the house, too. Jacobello smirked to himself, pushing away from the desk and biting his thumb as he looked it over. It was real. The cash, the stories, the power. The alchemist priest was real, and he hid his treasure away in the bowels of Rome to keep her safe from greedy magicians. His body thrummed, blood rushing under his skin until all of him was flush and sweat dripped down his back. He swallowed on a dry throat and opened the window, sighing with a shiver at the night breeze that blanketed his naked skin. He stared down at the city with a wicked smile. All of them live atop the great library of hidden wisdom in Rome's history this side of Christ, he thought, and none of them know it. Even the elders don't recognize it, unless they're hiding it for themselves. He smirked and added aloud, or they're afraid. But what good has fear done but to stagnate us? He chuckled, fingers stroking his own skin as he crossed his arms and basked in the moonlight. But why should I be surprised when these fools don't even realize their beloved priests are working beside us for answers to their God? He leaned on the sill and looked past the city, falling into memory as the countryside rolled behind his eyes. The wild hills and the shore, the roar of waves, the wild flowers and smell of black earth. He smiled as Bello's face came into view, his hand in his, pulling him into a run through the wild pasture to look at the stars and read their old magic books in peace, to drink and dance naked beneath the moon, to scare the people by prowling the town in animal skins. He looked at the stars for the hour and sighed. There would be little sleep tonight after all. He leaned against the window, chuckling at the thought of Bello and him conceiving their mischief in the old city of Rome. What vile things they might conjure and disperse. What horrors from darkness and outer places they might call and glean lost wisdom. What fun they could play with their chemicals and elements and transmutations. So many wigs to catch fire, so many dinners to spoil, so many unnatural pests to let loose. So little time. He looked over his shoulder at the desk before finding the stars again and laughing. If I'm to be sleepless, then at least I can revel with you, brother. He pulled a candle from the top drawer and lit it, setting the ink and quill above the parchment. It would only be a brief letter. Then he would be off to bed. My dearest Bello, it seems time has flown too quickly since last I wrote. I hope my previous letters found you well, as yours have done me. But I must be quick, as I write this late in the night, and the society fathers want me working from dawn to dinner. Brother, the things I have seen, the things I've learned, you would be astonished. I saw a man summon a spirit with my very eyes. Metals transmuted, animals reconfigured into nightmarish, beautiful creatures to serve us in our secret places. The sickness I've witnessed, both cured and afflicted, is gruesome, but fascinating. I wish you were here to share it all with me. Soon, you say. Soon you'll be back in the bosom of your friend, and the world will screech for our raucousness, as we stalk the night in search of old hidden things and conjure the forgotten divinities out of man's flesh. But until then, I must continue as I have been. The money enclosed with my letter isn't much this month, but I've been in need of supplies, because, oh, this is sore exciting, beloved Bello. The society house my chapters charged me to keep belonged to the Alchemist of Rome, the Pope's alchemist, the chief magician among the holy men, and I believe I've found his secrets. He buried clues in his study that led me throughout his home, uncovering stone and painting and digging in the earth for riddle after riddle that I brought together. It led me to a false door in the cellar that went into the bowels of Rome herself. A message was carved into the bricks, warning to let his secrets die with him, so I suppose he did die in Rome after all. Pity. But it gave a final riddle of the Pleiades, the 7 sisters upon which the heavens turn. I found the marks and followed them until tonight. Oh, brother, tonight I found the last. I found his seal on the wall of a hidden tunnel. I found his motto with it, and beneath it all was an old, forgotten sigil that nearly took my sight. It's real, Bello. All of it's real. Tomorrow I plan to find a way past the wall and claim his treasure. The secret wisdom shan't be lost, and when I hold it, the elders must look to me with respect. Even if they take it all from my hands, I will always be the one who found the trove of the alchemist priest of Rome. None shall take that from me. Oh, dearest friend, how I wish you were here so we might celebrate. But soon you shall be here. Only a little while until that business of your marriage is done, and you and Olympia can join me in our manse and comb through the tomes of starry knowledge gleaned from light and shadow alike. Love, your dearest friend, Jacobello. The next day, dusk couldn't come early enough, as Jacobello threw the satchel over his shoulder and made his way through the chapter house. He passed recruits and acolytes and fellow initiates as he wove through the halls, past the library, the record hall, the stairs to the offices above and the laboratories below, until he found the great room. He signed out his name with Antonio behind the desk and set his wide-brimmed hat as he bolted for the door, waving madly to the old fathers in the sitting room, through the archway, interviewing another potential initiate. "What's got you in such a state?" Antonio called before Jacobello leapt from the door. Without turning, he laughed. "Private matters!" Then pushed through the old wooden door and down the little steps to weave the narrow streets of Rome. His shoes clacked and thudded as he raced past onlookers, slowing to bow comically to a group of young ladies outside a cafe before sprinting back. Round one corner and another and a third, Jacobello panted, heart thudding against his ribs as he raced to beat the setting sun. "It has to be behind the wall," he thought as spittle flung from his lips on the back of his breath. "Whether he made a way in or not, I'll make one like I did to the sewers." His foot caught a step and nearly sent him onto his face as he cursed and righted himself beside an old man and woman climbing the steps to their home. He stopped and bowed his head, apologizing before sprinting back his way, looking behind him to check the still setting sun. He cursed under his breath and ran like a horse, the wind gripping his back and spurring him on like it could fly him faster. Sweat-soaked clothes clung to his skin until he might as well have been nude. He shivered in the wind lashing him from behind, but as quickly as it came, he turned the last corner out of the breeze, nearly losing his cap, and plucked the keys from his satchel. He skidded to a stop before the house gates, eyes wide and boring through the air after his own imagination of what could be behind the wall, never checking for pickpockets or robbers. The gates opened as he bolted, slamming them shut behind as he flew through the little court, hedged in freshly cut bushes and not yet budding flowers. He unlocked the dark wood front door, ignoring the dark windows like a dozen eyes over him as he pushed through and slammed it shut. The foyer, the halls, the study all blurred together as he moved like a whirlwind. He ignored his rumbling stomach and aching back and feet. He needed supplies. He needed the alchemist's trove, not rest. 3 trips later to the cellar and back, Jacobello stood before the yawning secret door to the underworld, satchel on his back, hammer and pickaxe hanging from his belt, the lamp in one hand and the map in the other. He smiled and climbed the steps, descending below alongside the sun as he pulled a fresh cloth over his nose and mouth. He passed the stack of bricks into the alchemist's secret tunnels and the city sewers, following the shorter path he'd drawn, and making it to the dead end in half the time. He set the lamp down with the satchel beside, cramming the map within before he picked up the hammer and swung. He pounded the wall until the bricks began to splinter, crumble, and crack, until his arms and back ached. He stepped back to examine his work, panting as he traded the hammer for the pickaxe and broke through layer after layer of brick, 3 in all, until something gave way. He stared at the pickaxe hanging on the wall, masked down around his throat to breathe easier, chest aching and limbs weak with the loss of momentum. He swallowed, cursing himself for not having drunk any water or wine before the venture, but he pried the pickaxe away and stepped back, smiling at the little black hole poking through the other side. He took up the hammer and swung with a grunt, muscles not so sore as he pummeled the thin spot in the crater that he'd made in the wall. The tunnels echoed with his laughter and grunts until a fist-sized hole hung in the wall. He dropped the hammer and picked up the lamp, creeping closer to the darkness and peering inside. Long shadows trailed behind tables along the walls of the room beyond. Shelves stood somewhere in the back with books and bottles and glass cases all covered in dust. Jacobello smiled, laughing and stepping back as he pulled his sweat-soaked shirt from his back, the lamp replaced with the hammer and his gleeful jumps by hard, erratic swings surrounded by manic laughter. He swung and swung and swung, aiming for the lower half to keep the mark and motto undamaged, until the hole grew from the size of a fist to a head to a dog, then just big enough for a small man to crouch through. The hammer thudded down, and the lamp rose in his hand as he stood there, the dead-end wall almost smiling at him, inviting him inside. Time sped and slowed as he knelt beneath the makeshift passage, half crawling into the room untouched for a century. He stood, panting, skinny upper body dripping with sweat, as he grinned at the alchemist's horde like a stupid boy. He stood frozen, eyes darting around the dim room, lamp creaking in protest as he whirled it around to investigate, swiping hair from his wet forehead. The tables were clear, save for the dusty equipment here and there, and cabinets in the corners opposite the shelves. He opened them, finding plates, bowls, and glass tubes and bottles, all of which were empty. He turned, leaving them open to find one of the machines closest to him, a circular thing with a branch of metal coming from the center and bars radiating from the top, ending in clamps that would fit some of the glass tubes that he'd already found. His fingers hovered in the air over the machine. He licked his lips, eyes sparkling as they flitted to the next one, an iron and glass thing with a narrow door that reeked of ashes and chemicals as he opened it. He followed the table on the left of the room to a patch of shelves branching off from those on the back walls, fingers reaching up for one of the dozens of bottles and bringing it before the lamp. He blew on it and wiped the label clean of dust, face going pale when he saw that it read black powder. He set it back in its place and wiped a few other labels clean, each holding other powders, chemicals, and elements, and none of them mild or simple. He turned to the shelves, swiveling to look at the breadth of the room, eyes skipping over the bare patch in the middle to look at both collections. Glass jars sat sealed with gray and yellow plants he'd never seen before. Cases near the top shelves held an array of strange, misshapen skeletons, one showing the development of the human skull from infancy to adulthood. A shadow box hanging above the bare patch between the shelves held 24 insects, and none of them natural. Moths with the stingers of wasps, flies or beetles with too many legs, and things like spiders or scorpions, but far too large, and their stinging tails cluttered with dexterous tendrils. The greatest occupants, though, were the books. 100 at least. Dozens bore titles on their spines, but almost all of them were unmarked. Slender pads, common books, and great codices alike. He pulled one down and brushed the old leather face, fingers running over the Alchemist's insignia, the same as what guided Jacobello through Rome's underbelly. He carefully opened the thick tome and flitted his eyes over the notes. They'd been written carefully, but the priest's dialect was difficult to read, and the subjects were advanced, more so likely than even the experiments of the society elders. But he read, and reread the notes, coming away with 3 questions for each of the insights he could glean, but those insights would put him leagues ahead of the other initiates. The creation of flame from simple gases, the transmutation of alloys, the use of refined elements to better protect against both physical and spiritual plague, the chemical means of the purification of blood. He gently shut the book and slid it into his satchel, thinking, I can't tell anyone about this. With all this, I could lead the chapter in less than a year. He chuckled and added aloud, I could forge my own society. There are dozens of rejected applicants I could contact. He slid his fingers over the entitled books. Some he'd read, others he'd heard of but could read later, and some as foreign to him as the ways of the Ottomans. We wouldn't have a chapter house, and I certainly couldn't operate out of the manse, although the extra hands would help in chores and restoration. He licked his lips as he passed by the bare spot between the books and glanced at the largely bare spines, the thought almost lost. But one of them is bound to have a house or apartment in the city that we could convene in. He pulled down one of the blank books, a simple thing bound in thin, stiff leather that would have moved like the paper within if not for age. He opened it on a wild field of notes and drawings clustered together, dozens at a time, dedicated to solving a particular formula or another, some never ending in answer. One was for the purification of water, but the alchemist's dialect was so foreign Jacobello couldn't understand whether it was for drinking or for holy rites. Another, much larger, proposed a means to transmute dead flesh. Corpses were merged into a new body by means the society considered commonplace, but the medical reanimation was archaic. It ended in failure. But the last section saw the use of magic and science alike to reanimate the chimerical abominations, and succeeded. The last page of that study had a final note written in large print.
"Do not repeat under penalty of anathema."
Jacobello swallowed and licked his lips, closing the journal and sliding it back in place despite not having looked at half of it. He lifted the lamp to the top shelf, whispering to himself, "I suppose we could meet in the wild or the back alleys like a coven of pagans." His half-hearted chuckles died like his smile, furrowing his brows at 3 books furthest right of the top shelf. He mouthed their titles twice before he set the lamp down, squinting his eyes as he reached up on tiptoes with trembling hands and leaping heart. He swallowed as his fingers ran over the word homunculus on the spine, trembling as he opened the hardbound cover on the careful hand of the old alchemist priest. A note warned of the dangers of creating new life, and risk to one's soul by the summoned principalities needed for the animation of unnatural flesh.
"As in the days of Enoch,"
a portion read,
"when the watchers knew their wives and born unnatural life as the mighty men of old, so here I must brave the darkened light and go against the order of God's nature to create a new breath through the marriage of spirit and flesh. God forgive me."
He turned past the pages of the alchemist's intent and hopes, his warnings, to the beginning of the incantation. A long list of ingredients was given, each simple enough and commonplace to anyone chasing the forbidden wisdoms, or easily enough attained. Chemicals, elements, flesh. Living flesh. The homunculus wouldn't have been a reanimated corpse, or made of unliving parts like a golem. The priest's own hand demanded a woman's womb to bring in new life. As he came near the end of the list of ingredients and the proportion and times added, Jacobello squinted and blinked, rubbing strained eyes until he looked up with a huff and turned on his lamp. He spun the dial and pushed the wick up. It rose an inch and hit the end of the line. He stared and scoffed, looking around the room at the secrets he didn't yet know that he didn't know of, at the wealth of knowledge surrounding him. Then he fell back into the book, flipping past the ingredients to the order of the rituals themselves, 5 in total. He skimmed over their headers and sped down the procedures to at least understand what kind of evil was needed of him before he would flee back to the society house. The first ensnared the woman's spirit in her body that she might not die. The second prepared her body to carry the unnatural creature. The third summoned the homunculus's father, while the fourth bound it to the woman and to use its power for creation. The fifth seemed to be a simple banishing and cleansing ritual. He furrowed his brows as he flicked between the wick and words. Something wasn't right with 2 of the rituals. He sighed, fingers tapping the back of the book as he stood straight and thought. It sat at the edge of his mind, almost visible to him. It was something basic. The ratio of elements, perhaps? He thought. Or a different configuration of sigils with the incantation. Regardless, it shouldn't have worked. He turned back to the shelf and the other 2 books. But he must have been close if he had this much to write. Unless... He flipped past the rituals, looking for the logs and the failed impregnations, the effects on the women, the examination of the bodies. There was only a simple entry beginning the start of the logs.
"Success was had in all but the banishment,"
it read.
"Additional mortification must be researched to rid this holy place of the mark which I have brought upon it for my perversions of God's order. Until such time as I might banish the angel, the prostitute shall remain possessed of a fallen creature and bound within my laboratory."
Jacobello sputtered a nervous chuckle as his eyes washed over the words again, but that was the end of the mention of the mother. There were no logs of the progression of the pregnancy, her physical symptoms, the banishment of the fallen angel, nothing. The small paragraph was all there was of the mother, the prostitute, before the alchemist priest began his documentation of the homunculus from birth. He pressed on with the logs, smile cutting his face like a scythe as he jumped tens of pages at a time, scanning the lines and following the creature's quick progression and growth. He stood upright, book drifting down as he stared through the bookcase, thoughts raging like wildfire. Then, like it had been slapped in the face, his expression fell, his eyes flitting to the other two logs atop the shelves. And he pulled them down. The logbook slid into his satchel beside the now-forgotten journal, and he grabbed his lamp, rushing through the room and into the tunnels. There was more wrong with the rituals than the banishment, he thought. If I can figure out the alchemist's mistakes, I can actually create my own homunculus without any unforeseen failures. Even the elders can't do that, or are too afraid. I would become like God, breathing a new life into existence by my own will. Chills ran up his back as he approached the end of the tunnel where it met the sewer. He swallowed and looked around, heart sinking and gut wringing itself raw. He shut his eyes and whispered a small prayer of forgiveness, but the guilt didn't leave. Or was that shame? In either case, he sighed and looked back down the dark hall, swallowing.
No one else can know,
a voice said to him.
No one else can find it. It's yours. You worked for it, found it. You deserve to have all that knowledge to yourself, to become the head of your own society, to rival the papal occult.
He clenched his jaw, and the twisted unease in his gut became fire. He reached into his bag and pulled out a dagger, setting the lamp down to unsheath it and running the razor's edge down his clean palm with a hiss and scowl. He crossed the walk beside the grey water until he stood on the other side of the tunnel to the cache, letting the blood run down his fingers. When they were wet enough, he painted his crimson over the ruined red of the brick, drawing an old sigil, a true sigil, which bore the name of the holy angel which often revealed itself to the chapter fathers. He went back beside the lamp and repeated the mark, looking it over to make sure he wouldn't summon the wrong spirit. Pleased, he shut his eyes and took a deep breath, tracing his bloody fingers over his forehead in a crescent moon like the bull's horns. Ancient Hebrew fell from his lips 3 times, an old prayer of protection to cast out the shadows and malevolent spirits that would answer him instead of the angels of light. With the prayers said and the words still hanging in the air like a wall, he opened his eyes and spoke. O great Borhomut. Heat and cold fell on his nape. Hairs standing on end like a hungry wolf would rush him from the dark. But he continued, eyes fixed on the sigil. Accept my blood as offering and sacrifice, for evidence that I shall become your servant upon the fulfillment of my place within the standing of greater men than myself. For there shall I serve you the better than alone and lowly, and, being your station is amongst the righteous angels, I shall thus serve the greater God's will. For who among his angels might work against him? O great Borhomut, answer your servant's call, and set your power within these signs, which bear your sacred name. So now none should have want to enter, nor look within this hall and beyond, that its treasures might remain hidden for me alone to uncover, so I might prosper you with myself in your service, bearing the starry wisdom. He set his hand over the sigil and closed it into a limp fist. His breath came quick and hard, body tensing as his fingernails slid in place over the drying slash in his palm. He screwed up his face and squeezed, fingers and nails digging into his own flesh, with a burning throb that choked the whimper and whine trying to claw from his throat. Blood spread between his fingers and down his wrist, dripping onto the sullied bricks of the sewer floor. He blinked damp eyes, stray tears rolling down his cheeks as he opened his fingers with a high groan, the ache pulsing up his arm until his hand trembled. He set his jaw, resisting the urge to look at the wound, and encircled the air above the sigil. Finished, his hand dropped, fingers twitching as he shut his eyes, biting his lip against the pain and tilting his head back with a shuddering breath. When he opened them again, the sight glinted in his eyes, letting him see the truth behind the material, the truth behind his lifeblood, scrawled on the filthy walls. The sigil wasn't dark. It was dim and brightening like the evening star as the sun set, light climbing until the sun fell beneath the horizon and the bloody lines shone like lamps, both of them. He squinted against the invisible light, ignoring the waft of breath at his nape to find the other sigil. He nodded with a smirk as he picked up the mirrored lamp in his bloody hand, and traded the dagger for the map with the other. He raced through the tunnels as the lamp dimmed, reaching the spiral stair and the dark cellar before the lamplight finally died beneath the stars amid the garden. He rushed into the house, back door creaking shut behind him as he dashed through the kitchen and dining room up to the stairs. He pulled off his satchel as he bounded into his open study, moonlight beaming through the large windows. He set the bag in his chair and opened the window before striking a match and lighting the candle he'd left from last night, setting the alchemist's log beside. He cast the bag away and pulled out fresh paper, kicking the chair aside to stand, leaning over the desk as he opened the first homunculus log to the rituals he knew had erred. He ran through them 10 times each, writing down his suspicions, crossing them out with hissing curses before conjuring another idea. He paced the room, heart thudding as he gripped his stubbly chin and racked his mind, following each idea to the logical conclusion. Each were failures, and as the moon trekked the night sky to its zenith, he found himself no closer to solving the old priest's failures. He looked at the moon, eyebrows knitting together in despair as his window closed ever faster. A shackle I'd gladly be rid of, he thought, then stopped, continuing aloud. A shackle. A shackle! The old fool! He rushed back to the desk, reading the binding ritual again and howling a laugh as he cast his head back and thrust his fists into the air. He fell back onto his desk, fingers blazing ink across the backside of the worthless sheet of paper. "Too tight," he said. "You made the bindings too tight, sir. You nailed the fallen angel to her flesh and didn't have a spell strong enough to pry it out of her." He flicked to one of his own journals, turning the pages to a simple but powerful binding that was easily undone with a simple loosing verse, one always listed with it. "The fathers called and bound a demon to a bird with these words," he said to the open air. "So it stands it should work with a woman also." His fingers stopped, and he stared down at his work with a panting smile. Without the spirits meddling, the experiment should be far easier, and the homunculus far less troublesome. The alchemist's words flashed behind his eyes, documenting not only the rapid growth of the creature's body, but also its appetites.
"Today marks the creature's 2nd year of life, yet it appears as a boy of 7. Its abilities have doubled from its first anniversary, as to be expected, but its behavior is queer. There are nights when I feel it watching me in sleep, and the staff, too, have reported the feeling of the creature's eyes on them, though it doesn't seem to be present. Its want of food is also becoming stranger. There has always been a greater desire for meat, but now it refuses to eat it cooked. And what else it does eat borders on gluttony. Its mouth would never shut save to chew, if not for the limitations of the market and my will at times. I wonder if the creature is beginning to enter what might be its manhood, as I've caught it ogling girls from the upper windows, as well as some of the staff. The women here especially complain of feeling its eyes, and though it appears as a handsome child, and even charming, they describe a great unease whensoever it speaks with them. I fear I may have conjured a predator, whom I cannot control for much longer."
"I will not make the same mistakes." However long that foul spirit inhabited the woman must have tainted the homunculus, made it something other. He stopped, brows furrowing above a slack-mouthed frown, as a thought struck him from behind. The binding you chose was so strong. Nothing should have worked, save to destroy the woman. He eyed the logbooks. Your first experiment was successful. Did you allow the pregnancy to continue whilst she was possessed? He swallowed and went to the journal, reading the initial log of the creature after its birth. Carried as any other child, he read aloud with wide eyes, and delivered the same. It appeared no different than a boy-child of men. Further tests have proven my hopes. His spirit is not of men, but more akin to that of demons. He straightened, cut hand finding his throat for the cross that hadn't hung there since he was a boy. The child wasn't breathed to life by this angel, it was grown by it. He gulped and picked up his chair, dragging it back in place to sit and read, to pick through the logs and find the homunculus's destruction. He must have destroyed it, he thought. Even I wouldn't suffer such a creature to live if I couldn't control it. Hours trickled by as he combed through the first book, detailing the creature's quick growth over 5 years, each entry dedicated to a week of observation. By the end, he learned the alchemist had hidden the creature away in one of his properties in the city, tended to with staff and visited frequently by him. The staff were noted as having been changed frequently to keep them from noticing the boy of 5, who looked like a boy of 14. And soon after this, the alchemist notes that he'd taken to living with the creature and posing as its father, or mentor, as it suited him. Hours more flew, and the moon had disappeared under the horizon as Jacobello opened the second logbook. But those entries were longer. Each one slowly became a diary, where the alchemist expressed his concerns for the creature's growing strength and talents, and its increasing perversion. In food, drink, drugs, sadism, and sex. The second book, though just as large as the first, covered only 3 years, and the final one only 2, each full of the alchemist's thoughts and assessments of his creation, each tainted by his mounting fear and resentment as the creature refused to die. It hadn't even been 10 years old, yet looked a man grown. It was male, and quite beautiful, but its strength and speed and senses were greater than 12 men, greater than beasts. Its mind was vast, wiser than any priest or sage, faster than the greatest thinker, more cunning than serpents, and cleverer than the best swindler. It was immune to every illness presented it, but could give that same disease to any other it willed. It delighted in poisons and venom, and played with snakes from the time it was very young, because, as the alchemist wrote,
"The boy delights in the tickling sensation which the venom of vipers brings within it as though it were a feather to the foot. The most troublesome part, however, is the innocent laughter. Had I been ignorant to the truth, I would never think my creation to be an abomination."
Jacobello shivered as he read of the sexual perversions and the creature's nightly hunts, for pain was pleasure to the beast, and the screams of terror and death were as ecstasy. Women, men, children, human or animal, the subject mattered little from what the alchemist wrote. All who garnered the creature's eye would face pain and blood and death the night it found them to satiate its appetites. And the means became more gruesome as it grew. Then its want of food. Jacobello heaved as he read. Raw meat was its preferred thing as a newborn, among fresh blood, but raw meat became the flesh of newly killed animals, then the flesh of living beasts, and finally the flesh of men. It liked the struggle men would give it, and it liked to play with its food, but the women's screams seemed to feed it as much as their blood and flesh. In the last of the priest's book he'd written, weeping, that babes were stolen from their cribs to feed his abomination, by the beast's hand and his own. Jacobello set the book down and covered his mouth, body tingling and stomach churning. But at least it's dead, he thought. He couldn't permit it to live. He despised the thing, yet for so many years, so many attempts. He swallowed and stared at the last few pages, whispering, what was it that could harm it? He picked the journal back up and finished the last pages, eyes racing like his heart as the alchemist's old words screamed up in too careful hand that he'd failed. He didn't know how to kill the beast, only to entrap it. Every spell and serum served only to annoy it. Every wound of the blade taken for pleasure and healed, every burn an ecstasy and mended. Every curse was rewoven by its own power so to leave it unaffected. Every battle and attempt on its life was only a game, and the men the alchemist had hired to kill it were made its bloody, screaming lovers. And after, its food. It lived, imprisoned in the walls of the cache he'd left, imprisoned for another to find, as the old priest implored the reader, from the century-old ink to do what he couldn't and kill his creation. Jacobello cast the book down to the desk and stood, the chair skidding back and falling away with a crash. His eyes raced with his thoughts, the warnings, the clues, the sigil. The alchemist had left none of his work in his house, in that very house, only the clues leading to the stone stairs, and the wall Jacobello had broken down, the same wall warning him to turn back. Then the difficult path through the tunnels, and the concealing sigil burning in the last barrier between the world and that evil. He chuckled, hand coming up to his forehead as wide eyes pictured the room and darted away from the empty place between the shelves, even in his own mind. He vomited a nervous laugh and leaned on the desk with his hands spread wide. My God, it was beside me all that time. He panted and swallowed, his heart settling as his mind whirled. But the incantations held after all these years. If it's dead, I could learn from it. What not to do.
Fix the mistake,
A voice said in the back of his mind.
You can control its mind as you would control the beast, or else shackle it as one would any spirit. It's a demon in flesh, after all, isn't it?
He licked his lips and stared at the journal. The old man tried to control the creature, and failed.
But the old man was using an unaltered spell to bind a demon,
The voice said. If I could alter it to account for the different nature of its spirit, combining it with a soul-binding spell, I could...
You could become its master and assume your place as head of the Papal Occult Society. You wouldn't even need to make your own homunculus.
He swallowed and slowly picked up the chair, eyes fixed on the journal as he dragged his seat back in place, sat down, and flipped through the pages for the exact ritual of demonic binding the alchemist had used. He pulled a clean piece of paper under his right hand and wrote it down without looking away from the journal. When he was done, he wrote down a binding and calculated the necessary modifications to combine the two spells, moving with unblinking eyes, jaw clenched and aching and skin cold. The candle sank down to the stand and drowned in its own wax, sinking the room in darkness and starlight. But he couldn't stop. The work was too important. The promise was too great. The prize was too close. So he worked and penned and moved with quick, jolting flicks as unseeing eyes stared at the edge of the desk, stared right through the world and into the howling void between universes. Sunlight crept into the room, releasing the reds and browns in the dark wood of the study. It seeped through the back of his shirt, through his thick black locks, kissing his skin and stinging the backs of his eyes. He blinked, sniffling and clearing his throat as the quill dropped from ink-stained hands. He swallowed and leaned his elbows onto the desk, back popping and aching as he dropped his neck and heaved a sigh. Something fell, clear and splattering onto a scrap of paper. He furrowed his brows and felt his face, pulling his hands away wet and wiping until he reached his eyes. He hissed when he touched them, blinking again as he looked around to the sun and squinting against the light. He creaked back down to the work on the desk. A sea of papers and notes and drawings, scattered at random, save for a tidy stack, sat in the middle. He picked them up, scanning the unfamiliar hand, coughing and clearing his throat as he rubbed his temple, straining against the light blazing against the paper. But as the words came, the heat in his veins returned. His heart thudded back to life, and his mind, once dragging and stiff, now poised and gnawing on what he'd read. And with it, the darkness of the night flooded back behind his eyes with a barking laugh. "I did it," he thought, standing and groaning against the pain and stiffness in his joints. "I fixed the rituals. I adjusted the binding. It should work." "Ye invented a whole new category of binding," that familiar voice whispered, and he smiled at it before he scooped up the stack of papers and limped to his bag. He shoved them inside, ignoring the scream of his body as he rushed through the house to collect his tools and ingredients. "If I'm to do this, then I'll do it now before the chapter finds us out." He went into his bedroom and retrieved the sheathed dagger and brazen cup for his lifeblood, rushing to the cupboard downstairs for the fat candles, then to the kitchen for the salt and jar of herbs to aid his connection with the spirits. With all that thrown carelessly into the satchel, he ran for the cellar, back door swinging shut and open again with a thud as he burst through the garden and raided the shelves. He passed the food and expensive herbs for the chemicals and elements in the back. Not sulfur, no, not gold, chalcedonium, or a chalcum. "I know you're here. Ah!" He grabbed the vial of mercury, patting his pants pocket to check for the gold coin of protection, and rushed to the hidden door. He flew down and through the tunnels, each turn a blur made from memory and intuition alone, until he came upon the burning sigils in his blood. He blinked and had rushed between them, crouching before the broken wall, bag thrown to the other side as he crawled on his belly into the hungry dark. He fished for the bag and got out a candle, striking a match and lighting it and all the rest in a shapeless mass on the floor. Then came the work. He cleared the floor in the middle of the room and forced himself to focus on the bare spot between the shelves. His eyes burned, hands balling to fists at his sides as he found the void. It was an iron door with different metals twinkling throughout and a lattice work of sigils and chants, all blazing in his sight. He blinked with a heaving breath and collapsed to his hands and knees, blood roaring in his ears as he lifted his head and gritted teeth, and set 2 candles either side the door. "Easier to focus on that than the door," he thought. Out came the chalk, worked quickly but carefully on the floor until it was alive with circles and shapes, each with rings of sigils and text, scripture and heathen alike. Then he placed the candles at cardinal points and every point and major juncture of the construct, chanting all the while in this language and that, summoning the angels Borhumut, Kafedon, and Azazel for their strength and protection, reciting the prayers of the ancient Hebrews, Egyptians, and Babylonians in their own tongues. Each word flowed into the lines of chalk, coming alive, forms lifting off the floor and sinking beneath it and never moving all at once, only the sight keeping Jacobello from the madness of it. The candles flickered as he ended the final chant and lifted his cut hand into the air above his head, repeating the protecting prayers to the angels as he brought the blade across the cut with a hiss, face screwed up into an ugly mask. He blinked the tears away and moved swiftly, dribbling his blood along the outer chalk line, chanting the prayers of protection a 3rd time. The candles swayed together as one. He rounded the construct, eyes darting over the floor, double, triple checking his work. Then he reached into the bag and pulled out the ingredients for the binding spell. He stepped inside the construct and set the brazen bowl amid a clear spot between the center of the main circle which he stood in and the door. He squeezed his hand over it until there was enough blood, then pulled the herbs and salt from their sacks and bottles. Salt and sage for the demonic, blood for power, and mercury for the soul. Then he took another jar of herbs and set it to his lips, breathing in one last time before he set the mixture of leaves and powders to his tongue. It was bitter and sour all at once, twisting his face into itself. Then he went numb as goosebumps danced across his skin. He let the mixture sit on his tongue, salivating and careful not to swallow it yet, not until his mouth was full. He blinked, and the light of the candles broke into 100 prisms, the world blurring in and out of focus, the lines flickering with light like the candles as the world beyond swayed with misshapen black figures. He swallowed the tincture of his own spit and shut his eyes, slurring another spell and bowing amid the circles, rising slow and rigid with his eyes shut and palms by his face. He inhaled as he rose, slow and careful, only stopping when he was upright and sitting on his heels. He set his hands over his eyes and exhaled, the stink of chemical smoke filling the air. When the exhale was done, he parted his fingers and looked at the door. Its light still the same, its pulsing power still awesome, but the burn was gone. He rushed with the next steps, mixing the ingredients in the bowl with his hands until it reeked, and pulled the papers from his bag, reading out the first of the binding in Aramaic. When he was almost finished, he drew the holy name of the Hebrew god on his forehead, and found the door as the last of the words fell from his mouth. He rose, bowl in hand as he stumbled forward, the power behind the alchemist priest's sigils like hands pushing him back. He leaned forward, pushing with all his weight, groaning as the heat of the light licked his skin like the promise of fire. But he reached the door, nonetheless. His bleeding hand found the lowest of the locks, each connected to a bar bracing the door into the walls of the doorway. He grabbed it and screamed like he'd touched red-hot iron, but he couldn't let go. He ground his teeth, eyes squeezed shut so hard they might pop as he turned the handle, cranking thrice before the mechanism whirred and the bars slid free of the wall. "You will be mine," he thought as some of the door's light dimmed. He reached above for another latch, twisting its burning handle and dimming more of the light. He did it again and again until all 7 latches were open and the light was gone. The power of the sigils vanished with their purpose fulfilled. He blinked the stars from his eyes, letting the sight sink back into the hidden part of himself to use his mortal eyes as the last of the herbs waned. He gripped the bowl hard, heart pounding as the charred remains of his palm found the stinging cold handle between the locks. He hissed, but gripped it, breath quick and quicker as his body went taut, and threw the door open on silent hinges, well kept by the sigil's power. Stale air blew in his face beside rot and refuse like some squatter's quarters, but it was no worse than the sewers. So he stepped onto the threshold and peered inside, good hand at the ready. It was black, save for the flickering candle light, but it was enough to let him see the cylindrical walls and domed ceiling, the gold and silver sigils welded to every surface, prayers and incantations embedded in and around and beside them. But their power was gone, like the sigils on the door. He swallowed, wide eyes flicking around for the homunculus. Maybe it died, he thought. It was a century ago. Maybe it's still mortal and rotted in here. Something moved in the darkness. He froze. His blood went cold. Every hair on his body stood up as he watched the shadow shift against the black.
"The bowl!"
the voice screamed in his ear. He looked down and remembered what he was there to do. He lunged forward, casting the bowl's contents onto the shadow with a splat. It didn't move, just sat crouching in the shadows as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. He opened his mouth to pronounce the other half of the spell, but the words wouldn't come. He stepped back to get the paper and read it, from the safety of the circle. The figure turned its head like a dog listening. Then it unfolded, slowly rising like its joints were unoiled metal. When it stopped, it was taller than the doorway, bonier than Jacobello, but with the frame of a strong man. Then it disappeared in the shadow. Jacobello swallowed, mouth agape as his eyes flicked through the darkness. His foot slid on the floor to pull him in a sprint to the protective circle. He blinked, and the figure had lurched through the room and pushed out of the doorway. A pale, gaunt face stretched open in a silent cry as bony hands grabbed his shoulders and a skeletal body pushed him down and across the ground. They landed with a thud, all the air vomiting out of him alongside a small breeze that shook the candle flames and stirred up the dust. The creature pinned his legs with its own, but he couldn't see it before its mouth sank into his shoulder. Jacobello screamed as it tore his flesh away, snapping free in long, stringy strands and spurts of black crimson. It swallowed the flesh whole, eyes rolled back like a shark's, blood dripping from its snarling lips and perfect teeth. It fell on him again, biting his forearm as he lifted it to protect himself. The flesh came away as easily as it had from his shoulder. It swallowed and came back down, peeling layer after layer from his chest, his gut, his arms, and Jacobello screamed, even as his stomach was opened and its hands plunged inside. His legs thrashed as his body went cold, as the world darkened, as the voice went silent. The creature's mouth, still full of one of his organs, fell on his throat and clamped down, cutting his dwindling scream like a cord. His throat came away with a wet slick, torso and head lifted off the ground before it bit through his flesh, so that his skull slapped to the brick of the floor in a pool of his own blood. He coughed, eyes wide and wet, and gasped for breath, gurgled on his lifeblood. His body went cold, stilling as the edges of the world went pale and blurry. He tried to say a final prayer, something to anyone that would hear him, but he could only cough and wheeze and spit. He blinked through the tears as the creature moved onto his guts and reached into his chest. Fire throbbed beneath a mountain of ice as pain and sting dulled and numbed, blurring like the edges of his vision. Meaningless. Everything was meaningless. There was no pain, no fight, just the next breath. If he could only take another breath, he could worry about everything else later. Just one more breath, and he might live, even as the blurred air above him coalesced into light. One more breath, even as the light took a familiar shape. One more breath. An angel? He thought. Just one more breath. Just one more. Just one. The light wasn't sharp or distinct. It was gentle as the crescent moon. It wasn't glamorous and divine, just something like a man. But as time slowed, each microsecond dimmed the light in the encroaching blur of the world. It dimmed until the glimmer was gone, leaving a matte white mass. Then it dimmed to a pale gray, and darker until it was like storm clouds at night. Then came the black, and with it feature and form rising and falling into a twisted face. It smiled at him with too many mouths, watching him with too many eyes as it leaned down with too many arms and legs, the black stirring wet and glittering like ink. It smirked down at him as he opened his mouth to plea. Then one of its hands was inside, grabbing him by the roof of his mouth and jerking him back and away. It pulled him through the air and out of the numb and pain and slowness of time. It pulled him up to its face, like a dozen, all at once, shifting around one another at different angles but never impeding the rest. A hand grabbing his throat as more and more took his body in an iron grip. He thrashed, mouth open and screaming, but it held his legs, his arms, his torso, and pulled him close. It smiled, each mouth a different shape with different teeth as they moved across the face. Its eyes bored into him, glinting with a dozen different shapes and colors from man and beast alike. "I know," it taunted with the same voice that spoke to him before. "I know you're so confused, but your kind so easily is made confused." It laughed. "Magician, did you honestly think that calling on an angel for power was any different than calling on a demon?" "I did not call you." Its hands grew talons that slid into his flesh, burning and freezing all at once, sinking inches deep. There was no blood. There wasn't any pain like he'd known. It was like fire and electricity swam at the edges of the wounds, but it froze and numbed like ice. It was pain, and it wasn't.
"Silence, fool! You know not whom you summon though you summon them. Don't you know my name is Borhumut? I answered, and you gave yourself to me."
"Lying demon! Borhumut is an angel of the Holy One!"
"And I was once. That's true."
It spat on the ground and smirked with all of its mouths.
"But even if you call on a righteous angel, if you call not on the one enthroned, you still make yourself the slave of witchcraft. Knowing this, do you think any one of the heavenly host would answer your call? Who would answer you but us from the darkness?"
It kissed him with all its mouths, tongues sliding over his skin and invading his mouth before it turned his head with a chuckle, hand on his face so that he couldn't look away as they watched the creature eat Jacobello's corpse. It sank its teeth into his bowels, stretching them out and gnawing them, swallowing them whole, body taut with slender strands of muscle. Its chiseled face dripped with his blood, the crimson running down its throat and chest and stomach, even covering its stiffened manhood. He snarled and tried to turn away, but the demon's hands held him like a statue until he found his own lifeless face, his gray eyes slipping in his sockets like a fish, his body flopping like a puppet as the homunculus pulled at the meat and exposed the shining bone. He gasped, eyes watering as he thrashed against the venomous touch of the demon.
"And you thought you could contain him?"
It barked another laugh, claws sinking deeper, yet there was still no blood.
"He was born as of the ones of old, like in my eldest children, the mighty men, the men of renown. You and all your ilk are so pathetically ignorant, a homunculus. He is Rapha, the first of the Rephaim born in centuries. Your ancestors worshipped his kind as god-kings, did you know?"
It kissed him, 3 tongues running out and tracing his face as he squirmed, twisting against the claws in disgust.
"Now he shall be worshipped anew, and by the very ones who claim to worship he who cast our king from on high to this rock."
"What of it?" Jacobello shouted, tears streaming his face as he thrashed, body shredding and breaking but never failing, flesh stitching back together as though he were wet clay. "What of me? Did I not serve the purpose of the greater God?" The demon chuckled.
"The God of this world is not friend to the one enthroned on high. And the greater God, may his name be praised above all others, has had great use of you and all those like you. But you did not serve the God of Abraham.
"No."
Now you shall come."
"No!" He thrashed and wept as the creature tore itself back with his liver hanging from its mouth. It found Jacobello's eyes and furrowed its brow, tilting its head to the side like a confused dog.
"Come with me, Jacobello. There shall be weeping."
"No!"
"A gnashing of teeth."
The creature turned and the world blurred into color and smoke and light as the creature's gnawing jaws mixed with Jacobello's screams and the demon's laughter. But as they went further away to judgment, and as time passed, the creature ate and ate until its once hollow stomach was bloated and Jacobello's corpse was little more than blood and bones. It blinked, groaning against the pain in its stomach, the gleeful pain. It groaned against the ache in its head, the thudding in its chest, the rush of blood in its once cold skin that made it burn and tingle. It moaned in the ecstatic pain and grinned, swallowing the last of what remained of the dead man beneath it. It blinked, and the world came into focus as the pain subsided and it looked down at the carnage. It furrowed its brows, smirking and looking at its skinny hands, feeling its body and the loss of muscle and beauty it once had. It looked around in the dim candlelight, admiring the glint of the blood and the white, white bones. The echoes of the man's screams still rang in the backs of its ears, hands slithering to its manhood as its eyes shut and memory sparked to life. The darkness, the opening locks, the dim light, the stupid intruder that threw something onto its back. It smirked and moaned at the picture of his face, the tiny body beneath it wriggling and screaming as it tore his flesh free from his bones. It bit its lip, hands working and wandering, spreading the blood across its skin as it played the carnage over in its mind and fell to its hands and knees, spreading its legs to grind into the blood and body parts. The light and life left the man's eyes, and goosebumps covered the creature's skin. It gasped and shuddered with a moan. Then it remembered the demon, and the man's look of angry sorrow, of despair, and it cried out with release like a desperate beggar, like a howling jackal, like a growling beast. It panted in the waves of pleasure and looked down at the ruin, smirking and calling it good before it looked over its shoulder at the yawning darkness of his father's prison. It rose onto its knees, shoulders wide as new flesh stitched itself under its skin, covering its bones with the meat of its meal until it was almost like a normal man. It spat on the floor in front of the threshold and turned, facing the broken wall his father must have made to brick off his repository.
"Now, to business,"
it said, standing and walking through the blood and seed.
"I shall find you, Mother."
Hey y'all, thanks for sticking around to the end. If you like the story, like the video and comment. If you want to help the channel grow, then subscribe and hit the bell so you know when I upload every other Friday. And while you're at it, share this to someone who'd enjoy. Alright, see y'all next time. Bye.